In the ominous autumn of 1758, evening did not fall upon Izmir as it always had. Instead of descending gently like a veil, it was thrown suddenly over the city, like a velvet shroud. In the narrow winding streets of the Frankish quarter, as the last orange lights of sunset withdrew from between the stone buildings, they gave way to an unsettling, bluish twilight. The trembling voice of the muezzin finishing the night prayer mingled with the dull, frantic tolling of the bell from the Church of St. Mary, saluting the city's multilingual, multireligious soul one last time. But that evening there was no harmony in these sounds, only panic. Normally at this hour, the streets would be filled with the shouts of porters, the sound of lutes spilling from taverns, and the laughter of Greek and Levantan women calling to one another from their balconies. Now, however, a deathly silence reigned. Doors had been bolted hours earlier than usual, wooden shutters tightly closed. On some doors, braids of fresh garlic were hung, believed to frighten away a sharp-toothed monster, while on the thresholds of others a pinch of salt had been sprinkled. People were retreating not to their homes, but to their shelters. Fear had seeped into Izmir's humid air, becoming a tangible presence that overpowered the scent of iodine and spice. Physician Yusuf Kerim Bey was one of the few figures walking with calm steps through this sea of fear, wrapped tightly in his cloak. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall, with tired but intelligent eyes. He had studied medicine in Italy, in the ancient halls of Padua, and had filled his soul with the light of reason and science. But now in the city of his birth, he saw anew each day how the light of reason fought a futile battle against a dark fear thousands of years old. The house he had just left was the latest fortress of this fear, the home of Nikos, a Greek silk merchant. The man who had gone to bed in perfect health 3 days ago was found by his wife in the morning, a corpse, as pale as if not a drop of blood remained. This was the 7th strange death in the last month. Yusuf Kerim replayed the moment in his mind. That dim room, smelling of incense and tears. The family's wails. The priest's murmured prayers as he washed the house with holy water. And in the middle of the bed, the body of Nikos, as colorless as a wax statue. Yusuf Kerim had conducted his examination with his usual meticulousness. There were no signs of poisoning, no signs of a struggle, not a single wound or bruise on the body that could explain the cause of death. Only, on the left side of his neck, almost invisible, were 2 small, red dots the size of a pinhead, spaced a centimeter apart. S elderly mother had clung to Yusuf Kerim's hand, whispering through her tears, "Vrykolakas, master physician, that cursed thing from the grave. It drank my son's life." Yusuf Kerim had gently pushed the woman's hand away. Superstition, hysteria, dark tales born of ignorance. But when he returned to his laboratory and examined the blood samples, his own scientific certainties had been shaken. There was no trace of the plague or any other known fever in the blood. It was just depleted, as if the body's life essence had been drawn out like a sponge. Shaking himself from his thoughts, he arrived at the imposing gate of the mansion of Izmir's Qadi, Ibrahim Effendi. The guards at the gate knew him. They let him in without question. The calm trickle of the fountain in the courtyard contrasted with the tense silence of the streets. This was the fortress of order and reason. Or it was supposed to be. Qadi Ibrahim Effendi was waiting for him at his desk in his study. The Qadi was a clever and pragmatic man, beginning to run to fat. What mattered to him was not whether the dead were vampires, but the letter of complaint from the French consul, stating that trade in the port has come to a standstill due to security concerns. The result, Physician Bey? The Qadi asked, his voice impatient. The same situation, Qadi Effendi, Yusuf Kerim said, his voice weary. No apparent cause. It's like a cardiac arrest from circulatory failure, but I cannot find what is causing it. The Cadi slammed his hand on the desk. The people don't understand cardiac arrest. They understand that the dead are walking the streets. This morning, 3 more shops did not open. The Levantan merchants in the port are not unloading their goods from the ships. End this vampire nonsense, Physician Bay. Do you understand? Find me a cause. Call it a new type of plague. A kind of poisonous plant. A disease spread by rats. But come to me with a logical answer that will pacify this populace and shut the consul's mouth. Otherwise, this fear will spread faster than the plague and suffocate this city. I am doing my best, sir, but without proof. Then create proof, the Cadi cut him off. That is your duty. To bring reason and science back to the city. 1 week. I give you 1 week. In 1 week, this vampire will either be dead or proven to have never existed. Otherwise, I know my own methods for bringing order to the streets. It was a veiled threat. The Cadi's methods usually involve the public. Punishment of a few suspects to make an example of them. Innocent or guilty, it made no difference. When Yusuf Karim left the mansion, he felt the weight not only of his own doubts on his shoulders, but the fate of the entire city. On one side, the cold and insufficient truths of science. On the other, the unshakable dark faith of the people. And right in the middle, the political pressure of the cad. He was completely trapped. He turned into the street where his own house was located. There was no one left on the street now. Only the howl of the wind in the narrow gaps and the fearful whining of a distant dog could be heard. Just as he reached into his cloak for his key, he heard a faint, dry rustle from the dark alley across the street. Like the sound of something dragging over dry leaves, he stopped. His heart skipped a beat. With all his senses, he focused on that dark void. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice stronger than he expected. There was no answer. Only the rustling stopped for a moment. Yusuf Karim thought it might be a cat or a rag blown by the wind. But despite his physician's logic, he couldn't stop the hairs on the back of his neck from standing on end. There was something unnatural, something stealthy in that rustle. He waited a few more seconds. Then, coming to his senses, he decided it was a trick of fatigue and stress. He quickly opened his door, went inside, and locked it 3 times behind him. But that night, even as he worked at his microscope in his laboratory, he could not shake. The sound of that rustle and the feeling that, in the darkness of the alley, a pair of invisible eyes had been watching him. The city's disease, whatever it was, had now noticed not only its victims, but also the one who was investigating it. Physician Yusuf Karim Bey did not sleep that night. In his study, which had been converted into a laboratory, the flickering light of the gas lamp moved over the anatomical drawings on his desk, the Latin texts of European physicians, and most importantly, the glass slide containing the tissue sample from Nikos's body. He returned to his microscope time and again. Pressing his eye to the lens, he searched for an answer, an anomaly, that science could offer him. For hours he watched the familiar, monotonous dance of blood cells. But what he was looking for was not there. Not the cursed commas of the plague bacillus, not the cellular devastation left by a poison, nor the trace of any other known pathogen. Science offered him only a healthy but deficient blood picture. It was as if a murderer had cleaned the crime scene. The murder was evident, but there was no weapon. As dawn spread over Izmir like a pale gray veil, Yusuf Karim lifted his head from the microscope. His eyes burned, his back ached, and his mind was filled with more questions than answers. He looked out his window. The streets, which normally began to come alive at this early hour with the activity of fishermen and vegetable sellers, were in an eerie emptiness. Fear had taken not only the city's night hostage, but its day as well. The Cadiz. 1 week deadline hung over his neck like the rope of a guillotine. If science would not give him an answer, then he had to try another method. He pushed aside the papers on his desk and pulled out a detailed map of Izmir from underneath. He dipped his quill in red ink and began to mark the 7 deaths that had occurred in the last month, one by one, on the map. At first, the dots seemed to be scattered randomly. But when he marked the seventh and final dot, Nikos's house, he paused and drew back. The pattern had suddenly become clear. The deaths were not concentrated in one neighborhood or on a single street, but they all drew a crescent-shaped arc, close to the city's northeastern walls. And in the very center of that crescent, like the eye of a vortex, stood an old, ominous place, the St. Garabed Armenian Cemetery. The place surrounded by high walls, shaded by centuries-old cypress trees, about which strange and dark legends were always whispered. It could not be a coincidence. For the first time, he had a concrete clue. He quickly got ready and went out into the street. But his steps were not directed toward the cemetery, but to the heart of the Frankish Quarter, to the lively street where the shops run by Europeans were located. He had only one place in mind, the shop of Monsieur Jean-Pierre, a Levantin bookseller and history enthusiast. Jean-Pierre's shop, which he called Le Savoir, the knowledge, looked small from the outside, but promised a journey through time once inside. The shelves, reaching up to the ceilings, were filled with both rare manuscripts from the hands of Ottoman calligraphers and newly arrived printed books from Paris and Venice. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and glue. Jean-Pierre was a Frenchman in his 50s, with bushy white sideburns and intelligent, mocking eyes. When he saw Yusuf Karam, he put down the book he was holding and greeted him. "Ah, Physician Bey. The last soldier keeping our city's fortress of science standing," he said, his voice holding both sincerity and a sting. "Or have you too come to believe this Vrekalaka's nonsense and are looking for a silver cross for yourself?" "Your sense of humor is intact, Monsieur Jean-Pierre," Yusuf Karam said, smiling slightly. "But the situation is serious. I need your knowledge and your archive, specifically about the St. Garabed Cemetery." The mocking expression on Jean-Pierre's face vanished. "That ominous place, why? I've noticed that all the recent deaths draw an arc around that cemetery." The bookseller's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Now that is interesting. A pattern ... logic. I like it." He disappeared between the shelves and returned a few minutes later with a thick, dust-covered, leather-bound notebook whose cover was peeling. "This is my father's city journal. Not just trade records, but also gossip and events." He flipped through the pages quickly. "Look," he said, stopping his finger on a line. "About 80 years ago, after the great earthquake of 1688, there was another epidemic of this pale sickness in the city. In the official records, it's called the Izmir fever, but my father also noted the rumor among the people. It is said that a shrouded shadow rises from the cemetery at night and steals the breath of sleepers. And the epicenter of the epidemic? Again, the neighborhoods around that damned cemetery. History was repeating itself. So what happened then?" Yusuf Karam asked. "Nothing," Jean-Pierre said with a shrug. A few months later, the deaths suddenly stopped, just as mysteriously as they had begun. No official explanation. It was forgotten. A lightning bolt flashed in Yusuf Karam's mind. This was not a murderer or a monster. This was something cyclical, something that appeared at regular intervals. Just as he was about to thank Jean-Pierre and leave, they were startled by a noise from outside. First, a single woman's scream, then the sound of a crowd turning into a roar. They rushed out into the street. A mob had gathered at the entrance of the Kemeralty Bazaar. In the middle, a woman, throwing herself on the ground, was screaming hysterically. "I saw him. I swear I saw him, at the fountain." A pale-faced man with eyes like burning coals. "He looked at me and then vanished like a shadow." These words were like a spark thrown into the crowd. A wave of panic spread instantly. A street preacher, standing on a crate, was shouting that this was the wrath of God, that the end of sinful Izmir had come. People were trampling each other. Shopkeepers were lowering their shutters in fear. When the Cadi's guards began to beat the crowd with their sticks to disperse them, the chaos grew even worse. Yusuf Karam watched this scene of mass insanity and horror. The Cadi didn't have a week. He might not even have a day. If this fear was not brought under control, the city would self-destruct. There was only one path left. He made his decision at that moment. Reports, books, laboratory work, all were insufficient. He had to go to the heart of this disease, this fear. He had to go to the center pointed to by the map, to the St. Garabed Armenian cemetery. His scientific mind told him it was suicide. What could he possibly find in an ominous cemetery in the middle of the night? But another voice inside him whispered that the truth lay not in the lens of a microscope, but in that dark sacred ground where the fear was born. Perhaps he could solve this puzzle, which he could not solve with reason and logic, by confronting the fear itself. As the sun set, physician Yusuf Karam Bey placed a small bag containing his surgical instruments and an old, silver-inlaid dagger inherited from his father under his cloak. Science and superstition would knock on the cemetery gate with him that night. At midnight, the darkness that fell upon Izmir was not merely the absence of light, but a presence in itself. The moon peered through the clouds with a pale, sickly light, turning the city's narrow streets into a labyrinth of silver and ink. Physician Yusuf Karam Bey, taking refuge in the shadows of his cloak, stood at the base of the high, ivy-covered walls of the St. Garabed cemetery. The centuries-old cypresses, like mourning sentinels stretching their fingers to the sky, watched him silently from behind the walls. All the noise of the city died here, replaced by an ominous sound like a whisper, made by the wind passing through the cypress needles. The main iron gate of the cemetery was locked with rusty chains. In any case, Yusuf had no intention of entering. From there, he searched for a breach in the western wall, mentioned in Jean-Pierre's father's journal, that had not been repaired after the earthquake. He soon found it. He slipped inside through the spot where the stones had fallen, where the border between the world's order and the dead's tranquility was weakened. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was colder and denser. The smell of decaying leaves, damp earth, and the sweet yet nauseating scent of night-blooming jasmine burned the back of his throat. The moonlight, filtering through the trees, drew trembling, ghostly patterns on the tombstones on the ground. Broken angel statues stared at him with empty eye sockets, and the Armenian inscriptions, eroded by time and moss, had become unreadable. Secrets. Every step he took cut through this sacred silence like a knife, with the crackle of dry branches and the rustle of gravel. His own heartbeat thundered in his ears like a war drum. Physician Yusuf Karam Bey, who had spent his years in the rational, enlightened classrooms of Padua, at that moment felt the reality of the primal superstitious fear inherited from his ancestors coursing through his veins. He raised his gas lamp. Its flickering light only deepened the darkness around him. He had only one goal, the central point he had marked on his map. With slow and cautious steps, he moved toward the heart of the cemetery, passing between old and new graves, between the ornate sarcophagi of wealthy Levantan families and the nameless stone piles of the poor. Finally, he reached the place he was looking for, the oldest section of the cemetery. Here, it was clear that time had been crueler. A few large, monumental family mausoleums rose above the other graves like small temples, and one of them was different from the others, while the iron gates of the others were sealed with rust and time. The heavy, carved stone door of this mausoleum was ajar by a hand's breadth. This was impossible. Such tombs were sealed from the inside as well as the outside to keep out plagues and grave robbers. Yusuf raised his lamp, trying to read the almost completely faded marble inscription above the door. The Corvelli family. The name struck him like lightning. A wealthy Venetian merchant family mentioned in Jean-Pierre's journal. whose entire line had mysteriously died out after the pale sickness epidemic 80 years ago. The connection was now too strong to be a coincidence. As he approached the tomb, he noticed something crunch under his foot. He bent down and brought his lamp closer. On the threshold of the door was a layer of strange, ash-colored, crystalline dust he had never seen before. He carefully placed a sample of it into a small pouch he had brought with him. This was tangible evidence that needed to be examined. As he straightened up, his eye caught a thorny bush next to the door. A small, dark-colored piece of coarse woven fabric was snagged on its thorns. This was not an 80-year-old piece of cloth. It was perhaps a few days, or maybe a few weeks old. This changed everything. This was no longer just a legend or a historical epidemic. There was someone alive, here in the present day. Just as he reached out to take the piece of fabric, he heard that sound again, that dry, unnerving rustle he had heard in the dark alley on his street. But this time it was much closer. The sound was coming from the pitch-black depths of the Ajar mausoleum. Yusuf's blood ran cold. His instincts screamed at him to run. But the face of the Qadi, the pale body of Nikos, the screaming woman in the bazaar, they all flashed in his mind. He could not run. He reached under his cloak and grasped the cool hilt of the silver-inlaid dagger inherited from his father. He knew it was irrational, but at that moment, the presence of that piece of silver gave him an indescribable courage. Slowly, trying not to make a single sound, he raised his lamp and pointed it through the open door into that devouring darkness. The light illuminated the damp stone walls and the dusty, cobweb-covered sarcophagi on the floor. And in that moment, in the deepest corner of the mausoleum, he saw something for an instant. It was not a monster, not a winged demon or a shrouded ghoul. It was the silhouette of a human, tall, incredibly thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. The figure froze for a moment where the light struck it. Yusuf tried to see a face, but it was completely in shadow. Then, before Yusuf could even blink, the figure, with inhuman speed and silence, retreated into a deeper darkness behind the sarcophagi, like an insect vanishing into a crack in the wall. All that was left was the echo of that dry rustle, reminiscent of a slithering snake. Yusuf stared into the darkness for a few more seconds, holding his breath. It was gone. What had he seen? A grave robber? A homeless, mad wretch? But what about that speed, that unnatural movement? He had no answers, but now his questions were the right ones. He backed away slowly and carefully, without turning his back on the mausoleum. He barely remembered how he got out of the cemetery, how he returned to his home. As dawn began to light up the windows, physician Yusuf Karim Bey was in his laboratory. On one side lay a Latin book on the plague by a Venetian physician. On the other, the silver dagger from his father. And right between them, the two small pieces of evidence he had brought from the cemetery, a pouch of crystalline unknown dust, and a small, coarse piece of fabric. The battle was no longer against a legend or a hysteria. The battle was with a real being of flesh and blood, nameless and faceless, but one that had a sanctuary, one that left a trail. Yusuf no longer just wanted to understand, he wanted to hunt. As dawn seeped into physician Yusuf Karim Bey's laboratory, it found him sleepless, his eyes bloodshot. Throughout the night, the two small, tangible clues he had brought from the cemetery had become the center of his entire universe. The fear of the city outside and the threats of the Qadi remained behind the oak door of this room. Here, there was only reason, observation, and the vow to uncover the truth. First, he examined the strange ash-colored dust. He placed a small sample, crushed in a brass mortar, on the glass of his most powerful microscope from Padua. What he saw when he leaned into the lens was not, as he expected, mineral crystals or common cemetery dust. What he saw both fascinated and nauseated him. Filling his field of vision were countless, microscopic, organic particles. They were the desiccated, shelled remains of once living things. Mostly, they resembled the fragmented exoskeletons of tiny, unidentifiable insects and mites. But among them was a species of crystallized, filamentous fungus that fed on decay, which he had never seen before. This was an ecosystem of decomposition. This could be the source of that dry, slithering rustle, the sound of millions of tiny, dry shells being displaced by the movement of a body. It was a rational explanation, yes. But for some reason, it was far more disturbing than a vampire legend. This was an unhygienic, diseased, earthly filth. Next, he turned his attention to the small piece of fabric. He washed it carefully, dried it, and examined its fibers. The texture was coarse and stiff. The dye was a faded, dark color that seemed to be a mixture of madder root and iron sulfate. This was nothing like the fine cottons of Izmir or the silks worn by the nobility. This was a functional fabric, made to withstand harsh conditions. It could be a sailor's canvas or the bale wrapping of a porter at the port. This clue carried the mystery beyond the cemetery walls to the sea, to the beating heart of Izmir. Throughout this process, Yusuf Karim tried to suppress the fleeting image from inside the dark mausoleum in a corner of his mind. That inhuman speed. That silhouette. His mind whispered rational explanations to him. It was a memory distorted by fear. Perhaps it was a leper, an outcast from society, a madman living in the ruins. Perhaps it was just a grave robber, and you startled him. But deep in his heart, he could not forget the supernatural stillness and silence of that movement. What he had seen had moved not like a frightened human, but like a disturbed predator. When he reached the limits of his scientific analysis, he knew he needed a second brain and a much larger archive. When the sun was high, he placed his findings in a small bag and once again made his way to Monsieur Jean-Pierre's shop. The bookseller had a curious expression on his face when he saw him. They moved to the small study table at the back of the shop. Yusuf laid out his findings one by one on the table. The analysis of the crystalline dust, the piece of fabric, and the name of the Corvelli family. Jean-Pierre turned the piece of fabric over in his fingers, then examined it with his magnifying glass. "I have no doubt," he said in a firm voice. "This is a coarse linen of the kind woven on the island of Chios or the northern Aegean islands. It's used especially on ships for sail repair and for wrapping valuable cargo, as it's resistant to salt water and wind. So, it has a connection to the sea," Yusuf said, seeing his theory confirmed. "More than the sea, Physician Bey," Jean-Pierre said, his eyes shining. "This points to a specific trade route. Now the Corvelli family. Venetian merchants. It's difficult to access their records from 80 years ago, but..." The bookseller smiled slyly. "I am not just a bookseller. I am also the unofficial archivist of the French consulate. Port records, the manifests of arriving ships. These are a treasure trove for me. My business has come to a standstill because of the panic in the city. Solving this mystery has now become a commercial necessity for me as well." Jean-Pierre was offering Yusuf a partnership. One would be the detective in the field, the other the researcher in the archives. "You bring me tangible evidence, Physician Bey," he said, "and I will find you the history and the story of that evidence. I will search for the Corvelli name in all the ship manifests from 80 years ago and from recent times. Let's see what ghosts will surface." This alliance lightened the load on Yusuf's shoulders. He was no longer alone. Just then, the bell on the shop door rang sharply, and a stern-faced man in imposing armor with the Janissary crest on his turban entered. It was Yaqub Aga, one of the Cadiz officers in charge of public order. "Physician Bey," the Aga said, his voice like a whip. "We were looking for you everywhere. Is there a problem, Aga?" Yusuf asked, a bad feeling in his heart. "There is. Another dead," said Yaqub Aga, and then he added the sentence that would change everything. But this time, it is not one from our neighborhoods. He was found in the hold of a Venetian ship in the port. A sailor. This news fell like a bomb in the room. The fact that the victim was a foreigner, and a sailor at that, changed the scope of the disaster. This was no longer a local public hysteria. This could turn into an international crisis. The consuls, the captains, the trade guilds. The pressure on the Cadi would now become unbearable. "The Cadi Effendi has ordered you to come to the port immediately," said Yakup Aga. He took a step closer to Yusuf and lowered his voice. "But it would be wise for you to know before you go. Physician Bey." A whisper is circulating among the sailors. The dead man's shipmates say that before their ship came to Izmir, they took on emergency provisions from an unnamed island in the Cyclades whose people are believed to be cursed. And with those provisions, a strange cargo was also loaded onto the ship. Jean-Pierre and Yusuf looked at each other. All the pieces were coming together with terrifying speed. The cemetery, the Corvelli family, the epidemic from 80 years ago, the ship's cloth, and now a Venetian ship carrying a strange cargo from a cursed island. The mystery had now spilled out of the narrow streets of Izmir and extended into the dark, salty waters of the Aegean. And physician Yusuf Karim Bey now had to make his way to the port to face the most dangerous wave of those waters. On a normal day, the port of Izmir was a living embodiment of the Tower of Babel. The massive masts of sailing ships and galleons from all corners of the world rose to the sky like a naked forest. In the air, the cacophony of tar, spices, wet rope, and the curses and bargains shouted in a dozen different languages mingled. But on that day, an ominous, tense tranquility had replaced the usual bustling energy over the port. As you walked through the crowd, led by the firm steps of Yakup Aga, physician Yusuf Karim Bey felt this change to his bones. The porters and sailors were not working. They were gathered in small groups in the shadows at the edges of the quay, whispering. Their eyes, filled with fear and distrust, followed Yusuf and Yakup Aga. News of a death would spread like a wildfire in the port, but this time, it was not just news that was spreading, but the whisper of a curse. At the end of the path, anchored slightly away from the other ships, stood a Venetian-flagged merchant galleon. Its name was written in gilded letters on its prow, Il Silenzio, the silence. Its name was in terrifying harmony with its current state. There was no movement on its deck. Its sails were furled, its ropes taut. It was as if it were holding its breath, waiting. When they climbed the ship's ladder, a stout, gray-bearded man with an angry and sweaty face met them on the deck, Captain Antonio Vivaldi. The man's eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness and rage. "Finally," the captain grumbled, casting aside respect even when addressing the Cadi's officer. "We have been waiting for you for an hour. You must put an end to this nonsense immediately. My men are on the brink of mutiny. No one in the port will approach my ship. I can't unload my goods. I can't get provisions. I'm afraid of being quarantined." Yakup Aga's hand went to the hilt of his cutlass. "Watch your tone, Captain. You are standing before an Ottoman officer. Now step aside and let the physician Bey do his work." The captain stepped aside, grumbling. As they entered the ship's inner corridors, a heavy smell of wine, mold, and fear hit Yusuf's nose. A few sailors, huddled in the dark corners of the corridor, looked at them like wild animals. On their faces was a terror deeper than the fatigue of being at sea for weeks. They entered a small, airless cabin next to the hold. The body lay in a coarse hammock. It was the body of a young sailor, Pietro. And at first glance, Yusuf was met with that devastating, familiar sight. The terrible tranquility of the moment of death of Nikos and the other 6 victims was also etched on the face of this young Venetian. His skin was like pale marble from a sculptor's hand. His lips were colorless. Yusuf brought his lamp closer and began his examination. Everything was the same. No signs of a struggle, no signs of poisoning. And yes, there it was, just under his chin, on the left side, those two small red dots spaced a centimeter apart. But this time, there was something different. Pietro's right hand was tightly closed in a fist. His fingers were clenched so hard that his nails had dug into his palm. With great care and difficulty, Yusuf pried open the fingers, stiffened by rigor mortis, one by one. And in Pietro's palm, he found a small, black, rough object. It was a piece of wood. But not ordinary wood. One side was charred, and on it was a strange angular symbol, as if carved by an animal's claw. It resembled neither the Latin alphabet nor Ottoman script. It was an older, more primitive mark. Uf carefully placed this priceless piece of evidence in his pouch. "Captain," he said, turning to Vivaldi, who was waiting behind him, "I need to speak with your crew. You will tell me everything about this cursed island and the strange cargo." The captain's offensive attitude had given way to a weary resignation. He collapsed at his desk and buried his face in his hands. "We should never have stopped at that island," he moaned. "Our mainmast was damaged in a storm. The nearest shelter was that damned piece of rock, not even named on the maps, south of the Cyclades. The locals call it the Shadow Isle. There's nothing on it but a few goats and the ruins of an abandoned monastery." "And the cargo?" Yusuf asked. "It was said to have been salvaged from the wreck of an old ship that washed ashore there," the captain said. "A few fishermen on the island sold us water and food. But they also came with this offer: a long, heavy chest to be delivered to a warehouse in Izmir in the name of a wealthy Venetian nobleman. It was said to contain rare antiquities and sacred soil from his homeland. The freight charge was so high that I couldn't say no." "Did you see the chest?" "Only for a moment. They loaded it at night. It was a long black chest, reinforced with iron. It had this damned mark on it." The captain, with trembling hands, drew on a piece of paper on the desk, the same symbol they had found in Pietro's palm. "My men were afraid to go near it. We placed it in the darkest, most secluded corner of the hold." "And Pietro... was he responsible for the chest?" The captain nodded. "He was a curious boy. While the others were afraid, he kept hanging around the chest. Last night, he said he heard a noise from the hold when everyone was asleep. He must have gone to check. Everything was coming together. That creature, that entity. It did not belong to Izmir. It was a passenger, an invader. And Il Silenzio was the ship that had boarded. Yusuf turned to Jakob Ugga. "Ugga, we must find that chest in the hold immediately." But just then, angry shouts and the sound of bells from the deck interrupted their conversation. They rushed to the deck. The scene was the beginning of a riot. The quay was filled with an angry mob holding torches, shovels, and iron bars. The local porters and sailors from other ships were pointing at Il Silenzio and shouting, "Plague ship! They brought the curse! Burn that ship!" A few daring ones were trying to climb onto the ship, while the Venetian crew was trying to push them back with oars and ropes. There was a deadly gap between the quay and the ship, and at any moment, someone could fall into it. Ugga drew his cutlass. "I must gather my men and disperse this rabble," he roared, but Yusuf grabbed the Agha's arm. His eyes were not on the angry mob on the quay, but in the darkness of the stairs leading down to the ship's hold. "It's too late, Agha," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "What do you mean, too late? The chest?" "The chest is no longer on the ship," Yusuf said, with a terrible moment of realization. The captain said, "I can't unload my goods. That means some goods have already been unloaded. And that chest, that strange cargo, was probably the first thing to set foot in Izmir. The creature was no longer at sea. It was in the city. During the day, it was sleeping in the darkness in that black iron chest in one of the hundreds of labyrinthine warehouses. And every night, It was waking up again to hunt. Physician Yusuf Karim Bey's hunt was no longer confined to a single cemetery. All of Izmir was now its hunting ground. And time was running out fast. That moment on the deck was like the final spark on a powder keg. The fury of the crowd on the quay had transformed into a tangible, dangerous energy hanging in the salty sea air. The sooty flames of the torches illuminated faces gleaming with fear and hatred, and cries of "burn it!" struck the ship's wooden hull like mallets. Yakup Aga drew his cutlass in an instinctive move. In his world, anything that disturbed order was suppressed with brute force. But Physician Yusuf Karim Bey grabbed the Aga's arm, which was as hard as steel. "Stop, Aga!" he shouted, trying to make his voice heard above the chaos on the deck. "If you fight fire with fire, all that will be left is ashes." His eyes darted between the panicked Captain Vivaldi and a giant-sized head porter, who seemed to be the leader of the angry mob on the quay. "We must give them a reason, not an enemy." Yusuf moved toward the ship's railing and shouted with all his might, "Oh, people! Stop!" His voice carried the calm, authoritative tone of a physician. For a moment, a few people in the crowd paused and looked at him. This was the only chance he needed. "This ship and these sailors are not your enemy," he continued. "They are victims just like us. It is not they who brought this curse to our city, but the dark cargo that came with them. Your anger is misdirected. Our enemy is not on this ship, but among us, hiding in a dark corner of our city." These words turned the crowd's fury into momentary hesitation. The head porter looked at Yusuf with an expression of doubt. "What cargo, Master Physician? What are you saying?" Yusuf knew he had to use this moment. He turned to Captain Vivaldi. "Captain, the manifest for that chest. To whom was it to be delivered? To which warehouse? Tell me quickly." The captain, panic replacing the anger on his face, brought a sheaf of papers from his cabin with trembling hands. "Here, it's here, in the name of Casa de Corvoda, the Crow House. To one of the old Venetian warehouses behind the quay." Yusuf snatched the manifest from the captain's hand and turned back to the crowd. "Did you hear? The enemy has a name. It has a sanctuary, the Crow House. The curse is hiding in that warehouse. Now, instead of attacking these sailors, are there any brave men among you who will help me cleanse this city of this darkness?" It was a stroke of genius. Yusuf had redirected the destructive energy of the crowd toward a single target. Fury had given way to a purpose, a hunt. The head porter raised the iron bar in his hand. "The Physician Bey is right," he roared. "It is time to hunt, to the Crow House." Yakup Aga stared at Yusuf in amazement. In 10 minutes, a physician had accomplished what he could not have done with a company of janissaries. He had turned a riot into a crusade. As the crowd flowed like a flood toward their new target, Yakup Aga turned to his men. "Surround the warehouse," he commanded. "Don't let anyone enter without my or the Physician Bey's permission." "We will finish this." Yusuf quickly left the port to find Jean-Pierre. The bookseller was anxiously watching the events from the ajar door of his shop. "Casa de Corvo," he repeated after listening to Yusuf's breathless account. "The Crow House. That name sounds familiar." He quickly delved into his dusty archives. Minutes later, he returned with an old deed record in his hand. His face was as white as if he had seen a ghost. "Impossible," he whispered. "This warehouse was purchased 80 years ago, just before the plague outbreak, by the Corvelli family. It has not changed hands since. After the family died out, the property was left to the Venetian consulate, but no one has used it. It should be empty and abandoned." "But it is not empty, Jean-Pierre," Yusuf said, a steely resolve in his eyes. "It has returned to its nest." The connection was now undeniable. The Corvelli family, who had perished in the epidemic 80 years ago. The warehouse they had bought, which had been dormant ever since. And now, a chest filled with sacred soil from the homeland, delivered to that warehouse. As the sun set, the front of the Crowhouse warehouse resembled a battlefield. Yakub Aga's janissaries were barely controlling a crowd of hundreds holding torches and waiting impatiently. The warehouse stood out ominously even among the others. It was a gloomy, two-story, windowless stone structure. On its time-darkened wooden door was a rusty iron figure of a crow with its wings spread. YUSUF, and Jean-Pierre came to Yakub Aga's side. "The door is locked from the inside, Physician Bey," the other said. "My men tried to break it down, but it's solid as a rock." Yusuf noticed the familiar, ash-colored, crystalline dust at the base of the door. He ran his hand over the wood of the door. It was not worn down by the salty sea wind like the other warehouses. On the contrary, it had a strange, slick texture, as if protected by some kind of oil seeping from within. "We must get inside without waking it," Yusuf said. "If we make noise, it will either flee or be ready to fight. So how will we get in?" asked Yakub Aga. Jean-Pierre was examining the old deed and a city map in his hand. "Perhaps there is a way," he said, tracing a finger over the map. "Look, the warehouse was built directly over one of the city's old sewer systems. These channels are no longer in use, but maybe there is an entrance to the warehouse from below." It was insane, but it was their only chance. Yakub Aga reluctantly agreed. With a few of his men, they found a nearby sewer cover and pried the rusty iron open with a groan. From below rose the heavy, nauseating stench of centuries of decay and stagnant water. Yusuf took his gas lamp and his bag. Yakub Aga was behind him, his cutlass drawn. Jean-Pierre, despite his age, had insisted on joining them, not wanting to miss this historic moment. As the three men descended into the city's forgotten, dark, subterranean veins, the angry mob waited. Above, they did not know it, but the hunt was not just inside a building, but also in the depths of history, in the final act of a war that had begun in two different times. And the curtain was now about to fall. The forgotten world beneath the city operated by rules entirely different from the world of the living. The first thing that greeted them as they descended the iron ladder beneath the sewer cover was the stench. A combination of centuries of decay, stagnant water, and deeper still, the primal mineral smell of the earth itself. The odor filled their lungs, burned their sinuses, and clouded their minds. The flickering light of Yusuf's gas lamp illuminated a narrow, arched tunnel. The walls were covered in a slimy green layer of moss, and a thin, black puddle of water flowing on the ground turned their steps into muddy splashes. The air was still and suffocating. The angry roar of the city above had transformed here into a deep, muffled rumble. "Are you sure this will work, bookseller?" Yakub Aga grumbled, one hand constantly on the hilt of his cutlass, the other holding a handkerchief over his face. "We'll die of disease down here before we find any monster." Jean-Pierre was studying the old city map in his hand. "The plan shows the warehouse's foundation is adjacent to this main channel," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the tunnel's acoustics. "It must be old stonework from the time of the watchmen. Perhaps a grate or a forgotten drainage cover." They proceeded slowly and with difficulty. With every step, unexpected sounds came from the mud and water beneath their feet, and every shadow seemed like a potential threat. Yusuf tried to focus his mind solely on the goal. But this place was even more oppressive than the ominous cemetery. This was a place where all of civilization's waste, all its forgotten things, had accumulated. In a way, it was the city's subconscious. After a walk of about 50 meters, Jean-Pierre stopped. "This must be it," he said, pointing his finger at the left wall of the tunnel. At first glance, it was no different from the other walls. But when Yusuf brought his lamp closer, they saw the outlines of a square stone block beneath the layer of moss, darker and smoother than the other stones. Yakub Aga struck the stone with the hilt of his cutlass with all his might. A deep, hollow sound came back. It was empty behind it. The three of them, together, pushed with their shoulders and levers. The stone block, which had not moved for centuries, slowly slid inward with a terrible groan. The air that seeped from the opening was even worse than the sewer's stench. It was the smell of stale, enclosed air. But beneath it, there was something else. The smell of dry earth, the metallic scent of dried blood, and at its very core, that familiar, nauseating smell of decay. The smell of the creature's lair. When they entered through the hole, they found themselves in the pitch-black cellar of the crow house, surrounded by stone foundations. A faint light seeped from the wooden floor of the warehouse above, and in that beam of light, dust motes danced in the air. Yusuf now knew what that dust was. That crystallized organic debris. Slowly, they climbed a wooden staircase to the main warehouse floor. The warehouse resembled a massive hangar. The ceiling was supported by thick beams covered in cobwebs. All around was a labyrinth of decaying bales, broken barrels, and forgotten trade goods. But in the midst of all this disarray, there was a sign of order, of a nest. In the darkest corner of the warehouse stood a coarse bed made of straw and rags, resembling that of an animal. And right next to it, it stood, the jet-black, iron-reinforced, long coffin-like chest. Its lid was ajar. "It's here," Yusuf whispered. Wea Kupiaga tightened his grip on his cutlass. Jean-Pierre stood back in fear. "Spread out," Yusuf commanded. "We need to corner it." With slow and silent steps, they moved toward different corners of the warehouse. They felt as if at any moment it would leap upon them from one of the shadows with that inhuman speed. But the warehouse was silent. Yusuf approached the chest. His instincts told him that it was sleeping there, inside that dark box. He raised his gas lamp and shone the light through the ajar lid. The inside was filled, as the captain had said, with sacred soil. It was a dark, almost black earth. But it was empty. The creature was not in the chest. Just then, from the very top of the ceiling rafters, came that dry, slithering rustle. They looked up. Two small, coal-like glowing eyes stared at them from the darkest shadow at the very top. The entity, like a bat, was clinging to the ceiling beams, watching them upside down. Its face, momentarily struck by the moonlight, was covered in pale, taut skin, and its lips were pulled back over its teeth, parted in a primal snarl. "Ya Allah!" roared Yaqub Azza and lunged forward, but the creature, with incredible agility, dropped from the rafters. It did not land silently like a cat. On the contrary, it landed with a thud like a sack of grain and crouched on all fours. Where it fell, now fully in the light, they saw it clearly for the first time. This was not a nobleman nor a ghost. It was a primal animal, deformed by hunger and disease, stripped of its humanity. The entity did not attack them. Instead, in a single leap, it jumped toward a nearby broken window and threw itself out into the night. "It's escaping!" shouted Jean-Pierre. From outside, the screams of the crowd, filled with shock and terror, rose up. Yaqub Aga and Yusuf ran after it, out of the warehouse. The scene was chaos. The creature had fallen into the midst of the crowd and was running toward the port, toward the sea, tossing panicked people aside like toys. Its target was clear, the ship it had arrived on. "Il Silenzio! Don't let Ida reach the ship!" Yusuf roared. Yaqub Aga and his men cut through the crowd in pursuit. But the creature was widening the gap with inhuman speed. It was approaching the end of the quay. Just then, something unexpected happened. The giant-sized head porter, who had been afraid of the ship but emboldened by the physician Bay's words, stepped directly into the creature's path with his iron cargo hook in hand. "No passage this way, demon," he shouted. The creature paused for an instant. Its eyes locked onto the head porter's. Then it lunged at him. But the head porter, with the strength and timing of years, sidestepped and swung his hook. The sharp, iron tip sank deep into the creature's leg. It let out a high-pitched scream of pain. Its speed had slowed. This was the only chance Jakub Aga needed. In a single leap, he was behind the creature, and with all his might, he plunged his janissary cutlass into the creature's back, between its two shoulder blades. The creature froze for an instant. Its body convulsed, the red glow in its eyes slowly faded. With a final gurgle, it fell to its knees, and then face down onto the wooden floor of the quay. There was a moment of silence. Then, the crowd slowly and cautiously surrounded it. Knelt beside the corpse. This was not a monster. It was a suffering human, writhing in the grip of a terrible disease. Its face now looked peaceful. Where Kupiaga pulled out his cutlass. "It's over," he said, breathless. "Yes," said Yusuf. "It's over." That night, the fear that had descended upon Izmir dispersed with the dawn. Qadi Ibrahim Effendi officially recorded the incident as a rabid and dangerous madman who had infiltrated the port being neutralized by the heroic populace and security forces. The deaths stopped abruptly. The city slowly returned to its normal life, but for physician Yusuf Karim Bey, nothing was the same. In his laboratory, on his desk, lay the charred piece of wood from Pietro's palm and the crystalline dust he had taken from the Corvelli mausoleum. Science had not been able to fully explain this epidemic, but he knew the truth. He had learned that sometimes even the darkest legends are pale shadows, born from a forgotten reality. And sometimes where the light of science is not enough, the best weapon is simple courage. 6 months had passed since the events, and the cruel, fearful winter that had descended upon Izmir had given way to the generous, life-filled spring of the Aegean. The city was as if awakened from a bad dream. The streets were once again filled with the laughter of children, the inns with the bargains of merchants, and the taverns with cheerful conversations that lasted late into the night. The ships docking at the port no longer carried fear, but new hopes and riches. That dark autumn, like a collective delirium, had begun to fade from memory. Physician Yusuf Karim Bey, watching his assistant water the newly planted geraniums in the pots in his courtyard from his office window, contemplated this false normality. The city had forgotten, or chosen to forget. But he could not forget. That night, he had left a piece of his soul in that cemetery. In that warehouse. He listened to his patients differently now, while searching for the physical causes behind a fever or a cough. He now also saw the nameless fears in people's eyes, the whispers that kept them awake at night, the ancient shadows in their hearts. He had seen firsthand the limits of science and what roamed beyond those limits. This had not made him a worse physician. On the contrary, it had turned him into a more understanding, wiser healer. In the afternoon, he closed his practice, and as he did every week, walked toward Monsieur Jean-Pierre's bookshop. This had become a silent ritual between them. The terrible secret that bound them had also laid the foundation for a strange but unbreakable friendship. Jean-Pierre greeted him as usual with a glass of Chios Mastic Rocky and a plate of olives. "The Qadi Effendi's clerk stopped by today," Jean-Pierre said, taking a sip of his Rocky. "The Venetian consul requested that the fine imposed on the captain and crew of Il Silenzio for damaging the city's public order be lifted. Said he has closed the matter and will not open it again. The official story is still a rabid madman. Everyone prefers to believe this lie. It's more profitable for trade." "Let it remain so," Yusuf said. "Some truths are too heavy to digest." "I did some research on the matter," Jean-Pierre whispered, leaning forward. "That cursed island. Its real name was Thanatos, the Isle of Death. In old records, it's mentioned as a place where Venetian nobles fleeing the plague quarantined themselves. But according to one rumor, the eldest of the Corvelli family was fleeing not just the plague there, but something much darker, pagan rituals and the search for immortality. Perhaps he did not escape. Perhaps he found what he was looking for and brought it to that warehouse 80 years ago. So the story ran even deeper. This was not just a creature, but the curse of a family's ambition and perversion, continuing even after generations. As Yusuf left the shop and walked toward his home, he came across children playing with a ball on the street corner. One of the children called out to his friend, who had kicked the ball far away, "Hurry up, it's getting dark." "Do you want to be left in the dark like the physician Bay's monster?" The other children laughed at this. The event had already turned into a fairy tale in their world, a boogeyman story made up to scare naughty children. The physician Bay's monster. Yusuf continued on his way with a bitter smile on his face at this ironic name. The man who saved the city was now part of the city's new horror story. Perhaps this was for the best. He entered his home, his laboratory. Everything was in its place. The microscope, the books, the jars of medicinal herbs. But on his desk was a box more precious, more dangerous than anything else. A locked, small box made of walnut wood. He unlocked the box. Inside, two objects lay carefully placed on cotton. The charred piece of wood with the strange symbol on it from Pietro's palm, and the small glass vial containing the crystallized dust he had taken from the threshold of the Corvelli mausoleum. Despite months of examination, he had been able to decipher neither the origin of the symbol nor what exactly the dust was. They were silent mementos from beyond the limits of science and reason. Sometimes at night, he felt that the symbol entered his dreams, that he heard that rustle again. He closed the box and locked it. He was a servant of the light, of science, but he knew now that even the brightest light must cast a shadow. And balance was not achieved by ignoring the shadows, but by accepting their existence and learning to live with them. He went to his window and looked out at his city, now completely at peace, its lights shining. He was no longer just a physician who healed bodies. He was also the silent guardian of the city's darkest secret, unknown and unthanked by anyone. And this was a burden he chose to carry.